But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about what semiotics actually is. Semiotics, simply, is the study of signs. It's understanding and analysing communication through signs. Now, the next question that comes to mind is, what is a sign? This definition is from Graham Turner in his book, British Cultural Studies, An Introduction, and I think it explains very nicely what a sign is. So, I'd encourage you to pause me for a moment and read what Turner is saying here. There are 4 things I want you to pay careful attention to in this definition. First, a sign is the smallest unit of communication in a language system. For example, it's a word, it's a photo, it's a sound and an image on a screen, it's a musical note. Second, a sign has a physical form. You must be able to hear it, see it, touch it, sense it in some way for it to be considered a sign. Third, a sign refers to something other than itself. Now that concept, the idea that a sign refers to something other than itself, is a little bit tricky, and if you're not quite sure what that means, don't worry too much. Hopefully, by the end of this podcast, it will become a little clearer to you, and over the course of the next couple of weeks, it'll become really clear. But a sign always points to something other than itself. For example, a photo of a person is not that person. It is a photo. Now that sounds obvious, but that's the kind of distinction Turner's talking about here. So a television program and all the various elements that make up a television program, say, for argument's sake, MasterChef, is not literally MasterChef. When you watch MasterChef, you're not watching the event live. It's a recording of what went on in the MasterChef studio. The fourth important characteristic of a sign is that it's recognised as a sign by other people. Signs and our understanding of them rely on convention. Now that's another important characteristic of signs, and we're going to refer to this quite a lot over the course of the next 2 weeks. Convention and what we agree to call a sign and how we define a sign plays an important role in understanding semiotics. So to summarise, a sign has the following characteristics. It has a physical form. It refers to something other than itself. And we acknowledge that a sign is what it is. There's a level of convention there. Underpinning the idea of semiotic theory are these 4 points. The first point is that meaning is abundant. Meaning is all around us. The world is made up of signs. Once you become familiar and more comfortable doing semiotic analysis, you will be able to understand the world as one enormous text which can be read. And at that point, you'll really annoy your friends and family because you'll walk around deconstructing everything and picking apart the meaning of just about everything that you see, and they'll just tell you to shut up. Now, this is a bad pun, but when you start doing spontaneous textual analysis like that and can't help yourself, that's a really good sign that you're understanding what it is that we're talking about in this unit. So, meaning is abundant, and this leads us to our second key point underpinning semiotic theory. Meaning doesn't exist in a vacuum. As Kate Bowles says here in her chapter in the textbook, The Media and Communications in Australia, meaning doesn't sit inside a text like a bone waiting to be dug up from the ground by an anthropologist. When we do semiotic analysis, we're not really talking about the hidden meaning of a piece of media or the hidden meaning of a text, although some of the meanings and some of the interpretations that we make do draw on history and quite broad cultural understandings of the world. But these are meanings that are familiar to most people. So when we do semiotics, we're not doing anything particularly unusual or doing anything different to how we go about making sense of the world in our everyday life. We're giving sense-making a new name, and we're putting a collection of terms and theories around what it is that we're doing. However, we're all natural semioticians. We all go around interpreting the world. Meaning doesn't exist in a vacuum. We're familiar with many of the meanings which media texts produce. We're just simply, when we do semiotics, we're just simply giving a name and putting some theoretical concepts around those interpretations. But the upshot of all of this is that once you learn to think semiotically and engage in semiotics, the world never looks the same way again. That's why this is a beautiful unit to be studying. At its core, we're asking you to look at the world in a new way. We're not asking you to look at the world in a way that doesn't make sense. And we're not asking you to unpick hidden, obscure meanings. But we are asking you to understand the way the world operates at a textual level. And that's very exciting. Now, underpinning all of this is a concept which for some of you, I think is going to blow your mind. The concept that I'm about to introduce inevitably confuses a few people. That's okay. Hang with it, and by the end of this module, and certainly by the end of the tutorials that correspond to this module, the idea will be more familiar and you'll be more comfortable with it. The idea is that without language, the world is meaningless. The world as we know it does not exist until we use language to describe it. Unless we can name something, unless we can point to something and name it, then it technically doesn't exist. And yes, I'm being deadly serious, because the idea that ultimately language is just a set of social conventions that we all agree to is what underpins semiotic theory. Let me say that again. The idea that language is simply just a set of social conventions that we agree to and use in our everyday lives is at the heart of semiotic theory and what underpins semiotics. Let me give you an example. Our names are a perfect example of the conventional nature of language. Let me introduce you to David. David is a hypothetical classmate of yours. Now, there is no intrinsic Davidness about David. We have this cliche in everyday conversation where you meet someone for the first time and they introduce themselves to you and you say, "Oh yes, you look like a David," or "You look like a Jane," or "You look like a Jason." That makes no sense at all because there is no intrinsic Davidness about David. Why is this gentleman called David? Well, when he was born, his parents decided that was the name he was going to have. Through a matter of convention, through a decision which may have been arbitrary to a greater or lesser extent, the world was going to know this guy as David. And we all agreed to do that. When David introduces himself as David, we simply agree to call him David. Now let's push this idea of language as simply being an arbitrary convention, which we just agree to use a little further. Let's assume for a moment that our hypothetical classmate David is an international student. Like many international students, and if you are an international student, you may fall into this category, you've decided that when you're here in Australia studying, you're going to go by a name that's different to the one your parents gave you. Perhaps something that might be a little more Western sounding, for want of a better phrase. Heaps of international students do that, and you might be one of them. Let's assume for a moment that when he was born, this gentleman's parents decided to name him Arn. All through his life in his own country, this person has been called Arn. So his friends, his relatives, his school teachers, everyone referred to him as Arn. Now, he comes to Australia for whatever reason, and I'm being deliberately vague here when I say for whatever reason, because it's simply an arbitrary decision in many ways. Arn decides that while he's here in Australia studying, he wants people to call him David. When he registers for classes, he puts David in his given name category, and we all agree, while he's here in Australia, that we refer to him as David.